A police officer leveled his gun at FBI Director Daniel Cross, not because of a crime, but because he refused to believe a black man could hold such authority. Within minutes, phones were recording, the truth was spreading, and justice was closing in. One wrong move could have ended everything on that street, but what unfolded in those 5 minutes shocked the nation. If this moment strikes you as unfair, hit like and share. Let's step into the story together. I was standing outside Murphy's Corner Market that morning, coffee steaming in my hand, when Maplewood felt a little too quiet. Not the good kind, the kind that makes you clear your throat just to hear something human. Sun on the pavement, light wind through the sycamores, a school bell faint in the distance, and then a black SUV drifted past like it didn't want to wake the street. Later, I'd learned the driver was Daniel Cross, the director of the FBI. In that moment, he was just a tall, composed man behind the wheel, keeping a steady line, obeying every rule you could name. No hurry, no wobble, no reason to be noticed. He was heading, I'm told, to a closed-door meeting with the governor, and he'd chosen to drive himself. No escort, no sirens, no fuss. If you blinked, you might have missed him. I didn't blink. What I did notice, what everyone around here notices, was the patrol car 2 blocks back, nose down, lights off, tracking the same lane, with that hungry patient posture cops get when their gut is louder than the radio. Officer Jack Whitman. You can live in Maplewood 10 minutes and still hear about him. Ex-military, sharp uniform, polished boots, jaw set like a directive. People call him decisive. They also say he doesn't like being second-guessed, especially by people who don't look like him. Not proof, just a reputation that shadows a man until it feels like fact. I watched Whitman glance at the onboard computer, tap the wheel, and angle closer. Later, I learned dispatch had pushed a vague alert black SUV, possibly similar to a car spotted near a morning burglary. Possibly similar is a long way from probable cause. On this street with this officer, it looked close enough to try something. He didn't call for backup. No quick code to the board, no calm request for a second unit. He slid into the next block like a fisherman easing toward a ripple. The SUV held its lane without a twitch. The driver's hands were at 10 and 2 head level, not a single move that said trouble. If you're used to seeing trouble, sometimes you go hunting for it anyway. I can't tell you why it bothered me so fast, but it did. Maybe it was the way Whitman's cruiser crowded the space, or the way the SUV never sped up or slowed down, as if the driver understood what it meant to be watched and chose stillness over anything that might be misread. Maybe it was simpler than that, a black man in a black SUV in a neighborhood that prides itself on being quiet becoming a reason to pay attention. Whitman drifted closer, left hand on the wheel, right hand hovering near the holster in that practiced, not quite resting place. He had that look you get when the story in your head is almost complete and you're just searching for a last sentence to make it true. I've seen him run plates, loop a block, try a question before a warning. This wasn't that. This was instinct, first procedure later. The SUV signaled and eased to the curb beneath a run of patient trees, the kind that have watched 1,000 small-town mornings and never learned to be surprised. No screeching stop, no protest, just a clean pullover like the driver had decided. If we're going to do this, let's do it in the open. I could see his profile now, older, steady, the line of a man who knows how to keep his pulse out of his voice. He cut the engine. He did not reach for anything. Whitman's lights flicked in without siren, authoritative, not urgent. He parked angled a little too close, the way you park when you want the other person to understand who's writing the scene. He stepped out, squared himself, and walked forward with the restrained bounce of a parade ground march. I don't think he modeled it on purpose. I think it's just how certain men learn to move. It hit me then how unfair mornings can be. One man doing exactly what the law asks of him, another convinced the law has asked for his hunch instead. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a guy with a coffee and a front row seat. But there's a feeling you get when the scales are leaning before anyone speaks, and it sat heavy right behind my ribs. Across the glass, the driver lifted both hands slightly, palms open at the top of the wheel. That gesture carries history. You don't need a caption to understand it. The kind of thing fathers pass to sons because instruction can keep you breathing. From the sidewalk, I could see the calm in the driver's shoulders, the practiced calm of someone who has navigated rooms full of egos and rooms full of guns and knows that neither room respects sudden moves. Whitman stopped at the window. He didn't lean in. He didn't smile. The space between them felt measured with a ruler you couldn't see. He said something short-clipped, the kind of order that doesn't invite questions. I couldn't catch the exact words over a delivery truck, grumbling past, but I recognized the tone: act first, justify later. The driver turned his head and replied in a voice I wish I could bottle low, even careful as a surgeon. He was asking for the reason for the stop. That much I could read in the cadence, in the way his left hand didn't move so much as a breath. I glanced around. A clerk had stepped into the market's doorway, dish towel in hand, eyes narrowed. A jogger slowed, tugging at a headphone like he couldn't quite believe the soundtrack he'd wandered into. The quiet I mentioned at the start had a pulse now, a quiet that waits to be broken. What made it worse was knowing the SUV hadn't done a thing wrong. No rolling stop, no drift across the line, not even a taillight out. When you watch enough traffic stops in a small town, you get a sense for the dance: how the officer opens, how the driver responds, the quick flickers of apology, annoyance, explanation. This wasn't a dance, it was a test, and only one person knew the rules. Whitman's hand floated closer to the holster, not touching, just grazing the air in that territory, as if to remind both of them where the power sat. I felt my own shoulders tense, even from the curb, even with a cup warming my palm. The driver stayed still, not frozen present. It's one thing to freeze, it's another to remain. From what I later learned, the alert Whitman saw could have described a dozen cars in 3 towns. But you know how stories get written in detail here. A coincidence there, and suddenly the mind draws a circle around the person who fits easiest. In Maplewood, we like to think we're past certain habits. Then a morning like this grabs your face and makes you look. He should have called it in. That's what every training manual would say. He should have asked for a second pair of eyes, a cooler voice on the line. Instead, he trusted his own heat. He planted his boots, lifted his chin, and pressed forward like a man who couldn't quite imagine being wrong. I don't remember deciding to pull out my phone. I just remember the way my thumb found the camera and my breathing shortened to match the little record dot blinking back at me. Not because I love drama, because something about the moment demanded witnesses. You could feel it on the sidewalk, in the doorway, along the curb. This wasn't about a ticket. It was about how quickly a morning can tilt when suspicion outruns evidence. Before anything loud happened, before any word turned sharp enough to cut it, was all there: the imbalance, the history, the choice. A black man in a black SUV, hands visible, doing everything right. A white officer with a story in his head and a weapon at his side. A town that tells itself it knows better. A camera or a dozen ready to catch whichever way the next minute fell. That was Maplewood at 8:07 a.m. Quiet, expectant, and not nearly as harmless as it looked. 5 minutes later, everyone would know exactly what kind of quiet it had been. Whitman flicked on his light bar without the siren, the way you turn on a lamp to claim a room. The soft red-blue wash rolled across the storefront windows and over the black SUV as it eased forward, then signaled and slid to the curb. No jerk, no panic, just a clean pullover, like the driver had rehearsed this more times than he cared to remember. Daniel Cross settled the vehicle in the shade and cut the engine. From the sidewalk, I could see his silhouette tilt once toward the rearview mirror, then steady. Both hands rose to the top of the wheel, fingers open, palms visible. If you've lived long enough in this country, you recognize that posture. Later I'd learn he carried his father's words, the way some men carry a lucky coin. Don't make sudden moves. Let your hands do the talking first. It can save your life. Whitman angled his cruiser too close behind driver's door, kissing the painted line. He didn't radio in. He didn't look around for a second unit. He climbed out, shut his door with a precise click, and came up on the SUV with steps that were quick but controlled, the parade ground march he wore like muscle memory. His right hand hovered in the air just off his holster. Not touching, but near enough that everybody in sight could read the implication. He rapped the knuckles of his left hand against the window hard 3 times. Step out of the vehicle. Now, the words were blunt, not shouted. No, sir. No reason offered. Just a command that assumed its own legitimacy. Inside, Cross turned his head. The sun caught a calm profile, older, assured, the kind of face that has practiced breathing where other men would reach. He spoke through the glass, voice low and even. Officer, may I ask the reason for the stop? It wasn't defiance. It was a reminder, soft as a hand on a table, that rules run both ways. Across the street, a middle-aged guy who just stepped out of Murphy's with a paper cup paused on the curb. He held the coffee at his chest like a church program and squinted at the scene. The market's door chimed as the clerk leaned into the framed towel over her shoulder, the late summer light turning the glass into a pale mirror. Somewhere behind me, a delivery truck coughed and rolled past, and then the block became a stage where every little sound felt louder than it should. "Step out," Whitman repeated, jaw set. His eyes flicked to the corners, down the dash, across the seat, through the reflection of Cross's hands, and then back to the man who hadn't moved. Officer Cross said again, "Steady, what is your stated reason for stopping me?" Just behind my shoulder, a soft voice said, "Is that recording?" It turned and saw a teenager, 16, maybe phone-up elbows, tuck the tiny red dot blooming in her reflection. She wasn't loud. She wasn't performing. She was doing what kids do now when something feels wrong. She made a record before anyone could say there wasn't one. Whitman's posture sharpened. He squared his shoulders to the window like he was pinning the moment in place. "Plate's not returning properly," he said. "Vehicle matches a description associated with a burglary this morning." A description. Associated, not "this is the car," not "this is the plate." The kind of language you reach for when your story is still hunting for facts. From where I stood, I hadn't seen him run a plate at all. Maybe he did it before he closed the distance. Maybe he didn't. What I knew in my bones was that nothing about the SUV's behavior had warranted any of this. Not the lamplight approach, not the barked order, not the way Whitman's hand kept drifting across the gravity of that gun as if pulled by weather. Cross didn't flinch. "My vehicle is properly registered," he said. The words were plain, almost gentle. "I'm asking you to articulate a lawful basis for this stop." The coffee man took a half step closer to the curb. "Seems a little much," he muttered. "Not to anyone in particular." The clerk in the doorway slid her towel from one shoulder to the other and folded her arms. Whitman's mouth pressed into a flatter line. He tapped the glass with his knuckles again, lighter this time, as if changing tempo could change the truth. "Out of the vehicle. I intend to comply with lawful instructions," Cross replied. "Please state the reason." A breeze came down the block and tugged at the corner of a takeout menu stapled to a pole. It fluttered and clicked and went still. My phone felt heavy in my hand. I didn't want to be the guy narrating tragedy into a microphone, but there's a point where being present and being a witness become the same job. "Officer," the teenager called, not raising her voice much at all. "I'm filming." Whitman glanced toward the sound, quick as a blink, then back to Cross. If the camera unsettled him, he didn't let it show. Or maybe he did. Maybe that quick flash of attention was the only honest thing happening. He shifted his weight, stepped to an angle that put the pillar between him and the phone, then tucked his chin as if the situation could be narrowed by posture alone. "The plate isn't matching," he said again louder. "And this vehicle, make, model, color, fits a witness report from this morning." "In what neighborhood?" Cross asked, still seated, hands at the wheel. "What time? What identifying marks? Is there a case number?" Those are questions an ordinary driver is not supposed to know to ask. Those are also questions a man who lives inside the law carries the way a carpenter carries a pencil. It wasn't a flex. It was a path back to reality. Whitman didn't take it. "Sir, exit the vehicle." The syllables hit like a door shutting. And yet in the space between each one, you could hear everything else: the clerk's measured breathing, the coffee man's swallow, the faint scrape of the teenager's sneaker toe adjusting on the concrete. The whole scene felt like a scale waiting for something small and heavy to drop. "I don't see any reason," the coffee man said, finally choosing to speak to the air. He pulled over. "He's calm. Just tell him why." Whitman's head turned a fraction, not enough to concede, just enough to register the presence of an audience. He pivoted back to the glass and leaned a shade closer enough to fog a corner with breath. "Last time, step out of the vehicle." Cross didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the phone. He watched Whitman the way a diver watches the surface before committing to the dark, gauging the wind, the ripples, the angle that keeps you alive. When he spoke, his voice didn't change. "Are you detaining me based on a specific, articulable suspicion of a crime or on a mismatch you haven't verified?" It was careful, lawyerly, and yet somehow human. He was asserting a boundary and buying time in the same sentence. Whitman shifted his stance a half inch forward, a half inch down. That right hand floated again in the air's orbit near the holster, and I felt the back of my neck prickle. You can get used to a lot in a small town, but you don't get used to a moment like that. Not if you're honest about what it means. Sir, he said, voice tightening, we can sort the details at the station. Step out. There it was, the shortcut. Skip the reason. Skip the clarity. Control first, paperwork later. The teenager's camera hummed like a second heartbeat. The clerk stepped another inch into the doorway, sunlight having her face. Across the windshield, Cross's hands stayed where they were, a picture of deliberate restraint. He wasn't refusing to cooperate. He was refusing to surrender the order in which cooperation happens. I don't know what Whitman thought he saw that we didn't. Maybe it was a story he'd been told about mornings like this. Maybe it was a story he'd told himself. What I saw was a driver doing everything right and an officer reaching for words that could turn a hunch into a reason. Plate mismatch. Vehicle description. Burglary this morning. The kind of stacked phrases that sound official enough to float when nobody is brave enough to puncture them. Officer Cross said one last time, state your cause. Whitman exhaled through his nose, a short, hot sound. He straightened, made a small decision I could not hear, and tapped the glass once more. The block held its breath. The next minute would decide whether Maplewood stayed a quiet town with an ugly story or learn the hard way how fast 5 minutes can rewrite a reputation. I remember the way the air shifted when Daniel Cross finally moved. Up until then, he'd been still as a stone, hands resting at the top of the wheel, voice measured. But after Whitman barked at him for the third time, Cross let out the kind of breath you give before doing something that can't be taken back. Slowly, with the kind of care you'd use lifting glass, he reached into his jacket. Not quick, not hesitant, just deliberate. From the curb, I saw Whitman's shoulders stiffen, his fingers brushing the leather strap of his holster. Every bystander watching understood what could happen if that hand twitched the wrong way. But Cross wasn't fumbling for a weapon. He slid out a worn brown wallet, opened it, and angled it toward the window. The sun caught a badge, gold, polished, unmistakable. It seemed to blaze for a moment in the morning light. His voice was calm, almost formal, like a man reciting his name in court. My name is Daniel Cross. I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. There was a hush then, like the whole block held its breath. Even the teenager behind me lowered her phone a fraction, eyes widening as she whispered into the mic of her live stream. He just showed an FBI badge. But Whitman didn't lean in. He didn't blink. His mouth curved into something that looked like a grin, but carried no humor. He shook his head, puttered, and then said it loud enough for everyone within earshot to hear Nice forgery. It hit harder than if he'd shouted. The words carried a cold finality, not doubt, but dismissal. Not, let me check, or this doesn't add up. Just rejection, sharp as a slap. The middle-aged man with the coffee swore under his breath. This doesn't feel right, he said, shaking his head. The clerk in the store doorway pulled her towel tighter across her chest, her lips parting like she wanted to say something but thought better of it. The girl filming didn't stop. In fact, her voice gained strength. The cop just said it's fake, she whispered this time for her audience as much as herself. I could see the hearts and comments scrolling up her screen in real time. Hundreds of people, maybe thousands, were watching what we were watching. Cross didn't argue. He didn't slam the wallet against the glass or try to shove the badge into Whitman's face. He simply held it, steady in the strip of sunlight, his hand unnervingly calm. His eyes didn't plead, they warned. I could almost hear the thought behind them. Every move is evidence. Every second is history. Do not let them say you escalated. Whitman's jaw tightened. He glanced at the badge once more, and for the smallest instant, his eyes flickered, not with doubt, but with something darker. I've thought about that look many times since. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't fear. It was refusal. Refusal to accept that the man in front of him, a black man sitting in a car on his quiet suburban street, could possibly outrank him. Out of the vehicle, Whitman snapped again, louder, this time his voice cracking against the windows of the store behind me. Cross didn't budge. Officer, he said, level as stone, you are making a serious mistake. I swear I could feel the tension wrapping itself around us, binding every breath. The man with the coffee shifted from one foot to the other like he wanted to intervene but didn't know how. The clerk took a step back into the store, then leaned out again. The teenager's camera shook in her hands, but she didn't lower it. I glanced at her screen and saw the flood of comments. That's the FBI badge. This is crazy. He just called the director a fake. It was already spreading. The story was leaving the block before Whitman even realized what he'd done. But he didn't seem to care. His lips twisted again, as if the presence of a badge he couldn't deny only hardened his position. The holster strap on his belt clicked faintly as his thumb brushed it open. Cross kept his voice measured. I am complying with the law. You are required to comply with it as well. From where I stood, those words sounded like iron disguised as silk. They weren't a threat. They weren't a plea. They were the last line a man could draw without crossing into defiance. Whitman's eyes narrowed. Step out! Now! The teenager gasped. Oh my God, she whispered to her phone. He doesn't believe him. He really doesn't believe him. That was the moment I felt the fear knot in my stomach, because we all understood what denial means when a gun is inches away and pride has dug in its heels. This wasn't about whether a badge was real. This was about whether a man in uniform could allow himself to be wrong in public. Cross didn't reach for anything else. He didn't drop the wallet. He didn't move a muscle except to breathe. I could see his chest rise, slow, deliberate, and I thought he knows one wrong twitch will write the headline for us. The coffee man murmured, "This is going to go bad. This is going to go real bad." And he wasn't wrong. You could feel the crowd tightening around the edges of the scene, drawn in by the spectacle, held hostage by the possibility. A few more phones were raised now, screens blinking red dots. Every angle of that golden badge was being captured, replayed, magnified, and shared. And still, Whitman stood there, lips curled, hand hovering near the weapon that made his disbelief so dangerous. I'd seen arrogance before. I'd seen men too proud to admit they'd misread a situation. But this wasn't pride alone. This was something uglier. This was prejudice dressed as authority, determined to outstare reality. And it was clear to everyone watching, whether on that street or behind a glowing screen, that the truth had just been denied, and that denial could turn deadly any second. That was the hinge. The moment when fairness snapped, when disbelief wasn't ignorance anymore, but a choice. And once it's a choice, the cost always falls on the person least able to afford it. I don't know if Whitman understood that, but we did. Everyone standing there did, and so did the thousands already watching live. We were seconds away from a spark. You could feel it in your teeth. And it all started with the badge that should have ended the conversation, but instead lit the fuse. I swear you could almost hear the air hum when Daniel Cross lifted his eyes and locked them on Whitman. He didn't flinch, didn't lean back. He just stared straight through the glass and said, calm as stone, "Whatever you do next, make sure it survives playback." It was the kind of line that carried weight long after it was spoken. Because it wasn't just a warning, it was a fact. Everyone on that block knew cameras were rolling. The teenager's phone, the corner store security cam, my own trembling hands holding up a screen. Even Whitman knew it. For half a second, I thought that reminder might pull him back. And for half a second, it did. His shoulders paused, his jaw tightened, his hand hesitated. But pride is a dangerous drug, and prejudice is worse. I watched him exhale sharply, and then with a movement that felt slower than thunder, but landed just as loud, he drew his weapon. The gun came free of the holster, smooth and certain, and leveled right at Cross. The sight line between them was a live wire. The street froze. The clerk in the doorway gasped. The coffee man muttered a curse under his breath. The teenager's camera shook so hard I thought she might drop it. But she didn't. Her breath caught, and she whispered, "He's got the gun out." Oh my God, he's aiming it. Inside the SUV, Cross didn't move, didn't even blink. If anything, he looked steadier. Later, he'd say his heart didn't race. But I don't believe that, because in his eyes, I saw something more complicated than calm. I saw memory. He wasn't looking at Whitman's gun. He was looking at another one decades earlier. A flash of his father pulled over on a dark road, headlights glaring in the rear view, his mother clutching the passenger door. A cop standing outside with his hand on the weapon, barking orders for a broken taillight. Cross was a boy then, frozen in the back seat, his father's arm across his chest, whispering, "Don't move, son. Just don't move." Now here he was, grown, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, staring down the same barrel. Different time, different place, same story. The cycle had spun full circle. Around us, voices rose in disbelief. A young man in a hoodie shouted from the corner, That's the FBI director, man. Put it down. The words cracked the tension like glass, but Whitman didn't even glance his way. His eyes stayed locked on Cross hard, unblinking. Cross spoke again, his tone as even as before, but sharper, cutting through the silence. If you fire, you will answer for every second that follows. It wasn't a threat. It was a verdict. Whitman's hand was steady, but I saw the muscle jump in his cheek. He was caught in the grip of something he couldn't admit out loud, the possibility that his judgment was collapsing in front of an audience. And pride mixed with the poison of disbelief made his finger hover too close to the trigger. The coffee man shouted, "Jesus, officer, he showed you the badge." We all saw it. Others joined in a chorus of voices trying to tip the scale back toward reason. But the louder they got, the more Whitman seemed to plant his feet, like surrender would humiliate him more than blood would stain him. Cross sat motionless, badge still visible in his left hand, right hand resting on the wheel. His chest rose slowly, evenly, as if he were timing his breaths to keep the world from collapsing. His face was unreadable, neither angry nor afraid, just steady. I can't tell you how long it lasted, seconds maybe, but it stretched like rope pulled too tight. My own breath felt stuck in my throat. Every eye on that street was glued to the same line barrel, to glass officer, to director history, to present. I thought of the girl beside me, 16, filming with hands that trembled but never lowered. What she was capturing could decide everything. One wrong twitch and her video would become evidence of a killing. One withheld breath and it could become proof of restraint. The crowd went silent again. It was a silence so heavy you could hear the buzz of a streetlight in daylight. The kind of silence that begs to be broken but prays it isn't shattered by the wrong sound. Cross finally broke it, his voice deep, steady, impossible to mistake. "You are being recorded. Officer, every angle, every second. Choose carefully." It landed like a bell toll. Not a plea, not a request, just the truth. And still the gun stayed pointed, hanging there like judgment itself. From the sidewalk, from the doorway, from the curb, every one of us held our breath, terrified of what a single motion could cost. Because in that instant, we weren't just watching one man pull a weapon on another. We were watching history threaten to repeat itself and praying it wouldn't end the same way. The first sound wasn't the siren we all expected. It was a tiny click so soft I only noticed because Daniel Cross didn't move at all when it happened. His thumb pressed somewhere near the steering column. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic, and then his hand returned to the top of the wheel. If you weren't watching like your life depended on it, you'd miss it. Later, I'd learned that click sent a secure distress signal straight to an FBI response team. Whitman didn't notice, or he pretended not to. "Step out now." He barked the muzzle and wavering his forearm tight enough to show tendons. The barrel didn't dance, but the faintest tremor ran through it the way a held breath shakes at the edge of breaking. Cross shifted just enough to show he'd heard, then stilled. His right hand hovered an inch from the phone in the console slot, so close I could feel the choice tightening in his fingers, then stopped. I could see him remember something older than this morning, something a father says to a son because he wants him to make it home. Don't reach, don't give them a story they can tell without you. Survival in a single pause gesture. Officer, the teenager next to me, said, voice thin but brave, "He's got a badge. Why won't you believe him?" Her live stream stuttered and refocused the comments, flooding so fast they rolled like rain. "Is this real? That's the director. Tell him to back off." Heart's angry faces, question marks. The internet wasn't arriving, it was already here. Minute 1 bled into minute 2. Whitman's jaw clenched harder. Command turned into cadence. Step. Out. Now. Every word a hammer blow against glass. He shifted his stance, a hair keeping the gun fixed, and with his left hand he fumbled at his chest pocket. For a ridiculous second, I thought he might finally go for the radio. He didn't. He yanked his phone free, thumb swiping with the impatience of a man hunting for vindication. He angled the screen toward himself and raised his voice, still aiming the pistol with his right. "This is Officer Jack Whitman," he said as if the street had become a press room. "We've got a suspected impersonator with a fake federal badge." The teenager's stream caught his words and flung them into the same river as ours. Within seconds, replies hit back like thrown stones. "That's not an impersonator. Google Daniel Cross. Turn your phone, officer, look at the face. Someone posted a headshot pulled from a recent hearing. Someone else pasted a link to an old interview. The comment count jumped by hundreds, then thousands. The block hadn't changed, but the audience had. Officer Cross said calm, cutting through the new noise, "You are escalating without cause. Lower the weapon." Minute 2 slipped into minute 3. Across the street, the coffee man cupped his hands and shouted, "He's the director." We all saw the badge. The clerk from the store stepped fully onto the sidewalk, towel twisted tight in her grip. A jogger stopped, tugged out one earbud, then the other, as if he needed silence to trust what he was looking at. Whitman didn't lower the phone or the gun. He twisted at the waist, searching for an angle that showed Cross's face without losing his aim. The camera caught the badge again, the gold flash, the raised seal, the photo, and sent it flying outward to a chorus of strangers who suddenly knew our street better than they'd ever wanted to. "Look at the comments," the teenager told him, not pleading so much as reporting. "They know who he is." He didn't look. Or he looked and couldn't admit it. Pride does that. It builds a wall too high to climb down from gracefully. He anchored his feet and doubled down on the only story that let him keep standing. "Step out," he repeated, more force than volume now. "We'll verify at the station." Cross didn't touch the phone again. He didn't reach for anything. He kept his hands visible. His breath measured that silent instruction from his father living in his shoulders. I realized with a sting, I wasn't ready for that. Even the director of the FBI had to survive a moment before he could correct it. Power doesn't stop a bullet. Restraint might. Minute 3 slid into minute 4. On the teenager's screen, a new wave of comments hit like a tide, pulling stronger. Tag the news desk. Calling local station now. Sharing to the city subreddit. Notifications popped and popped, a digital storm cell building over our quiet block. A stranger typed. He pressed the panic button, watch for unmarked Suburbans. I didn't know how they knew. Maybe they didn't, but it felt prophetic anyway. "Sir," the coffee man called again, more desperate this time. "Put the gun down. Everyone is watching." It sounded less like a threat and more like mercy offered before a fall. Whitman's left thumb tapped his screen. The phone's camera flipped. For a heartbeat, his own face filled it, jaw stern, eyes fierce, and then the lens swung back to Cross. The teenage girl's chat erupted. "That's him. Same tie as the morning briefing last week. This is going to go viral." Another voice in the real crowd, someone farther down, yelled, "Jack, don't do this." It landed like a memory trying to rescue him. Minute 4 slid into minute 5. This is the part I will never forget. Not because of the sound, but because of the silence wrapped around it. No siren yet, no bullhorn, just breath and the click of thumbs and the soft mechanical groan of a street light turning its head to watch. And inside that hush, a timing only Cross could have planned. 5 minutes. Since the first light bar flashed, 5 minutes since a routine morning turned into a live referendum on who gets believed. The teenager's views ticked past a number that made her gasp. "Oh my God," she whispered, "it's blowing up." Her voice trembled, but she held the frame steady, as if steadiness could keep the world from tipping. Officer Whitman Cross said, naming him with a precision that made the name feel like evidence, "You are being recorded from multiple angles. You have been informed of my identity. If you continue, you are acting outside the law." The comments hit like an answer. "Attorney, here he's right. This is 1983 territory. Tag the ACLU." The internet had stopped asking. It had decided. Whitman's face changed in a way I still can't describe, somewhere between anger and fear. Somewhere you end up when reality won't bend and you realize the camera won't either. His gun didn't drop, but the muzzle dipped a fraction. Enough for a breath to sneak back into my lungs. Jack the coffee man begged, first name and everything. Don't be that headline. And there it was, the twist none of us could have scripted. Whitman had reached for his phone to prove himself right, and the world had used it to prove him wrong. He'd opened a window and found a mirror. In fewer than 5 minutes, the story had left his hands. From minute 1 to minute 5, it all stacked: stop denial, the drawn gun, the silent alert, the twin live streams. Cameras outran sirens. Comments outnumbered witnesses. A small town moment outgrew the block that birthed it. I can't tell you the exact second when Whitman realized the tide had turned, but I can tell you how it felt on the sidewalk. The tension didn't vanish. It changed shape. It stopped being the threat of a shot and became the threat of a reckoning. And for the first time that morning, the weight of that reckoning seemed heavier to him than the weight of his pride. 5 minutes. That's all it took to turn a traffic stop into a national question. We were still standing in the same patch of sun, but the country had arrived and it wasn't going to look away. The street was holding its breath when the sound of a deeper engine cut through. A black Suburban rolled into view. Windows dark, its presence heavy enough to bend the air. It didn't creep. It came straight, certain the way a hammer falls. Doors swung open in perfect unison, and 2 men in suits stepped out. No uniforms, no sirens, just authority that didn't need decoration. One of them, tall, sharp-eyed, his voice trembling but still edged with steel, called out, "Lower your weapon, officer. That's the director." The word director landed like a stone thrown into water, sending ripples across the crowd. We all knew already the badge, the live streams, the whispers. But hearing it spoken from an FBI agent's mouth turned speculation into undeniable fact. Whitman flinched. For a fraction of a second, his face broke pale, as though he'd stepped into light too harsh to hide in. Then his jaw locked, pride snapping his features into a mask. "He's under suspicion until proven otherwise," he shouted back, his voice too loud, the crack of desperation just beneath it. Agent Lewis Carter didn't move except to take one deliberate step closer. His tone steadied as though the weight of the Bureau itself was holding him upright. "If you pull that trigger, you'll answer to the entire federal government." The crowd exploded in sound. "Put the gun down." Voices layered over each other, strangers speaking as one, the kind of chorus no one rehearses but everyone feels. Phones shot higher into the air, by angles multiplying the moment, already leaving Maplewood behind. This wasn't just a scene anymore, it was a broadcast. Whitman's partner, a younger officer, barely past 30, shifted uneasily at his side. His hand hovered at his own belt, eyes flicking between Whitman, the director, and the agents now standing like sentinels in the street. He looked ready to step forward, ready to speak, but Whitman's head snapped toward him with a glare so sharp it cut the air. The younger man froze, swallowed hard, and backed him down. His silence said everything. Fear had beaten conscience, at least for now. From the curb, the middle-aged man who had been clutching his coffee finally raised his voice louder than before, breaking the rhythm of the chants. "We all see who he is. Don't make it worse." His words struck like a bell, simple, unpolished, but true enough to echo across the block. Whitman's hand trembled now. You could see the tremor run down the barrel, though he tried to mask it by planting his feet wider, digging into the illusion of control. He still held the gun, but everyone watching knew the grip of power was slipping from his hands. Through it all, Cross never moved. Not when the Suburban arrived, not when Carter shouted, not when the crowd roared. He sat as he had before, hands visible, badge glinting faintly in the light. His silence was louder than Whitman's rage. His composure anchored the chaos, and it made Whitman's desperation look smaller with every second. The moment swelled bigger than Maplewood, bigger than the men standing in its center. It wasn't just an officer and a director anymore. It was the collision of two kinds of authority, local control clinging to pride and federal power standing on truth. And it was all being captured. Phones, security cams, live streams climbing into the tens of thousands. No corner to hide, no curtain to pull shut. The crowd's chanting grew into a pounding rhythm, voices layered like waves crashing against a breakwater. "Put it down. Put it down." Even the teenager's voice cracked as she repeated it, with the rest her phone shaking in her grip. On her screen, the numbers ticked upwards so fast she gasped. The world wasn't just watching, it was leaning closer, waiting for the next second. Whitman's face flushed, red blotches creeping across his neck. He could feel it too, that the story was no longer his to control. He had a gun, yes, but the crowd had the narrative, and the narrative was escaping faster than he could contain it. Agent Carter stepped forward again, slow, and measured his words, ringing out like a final verdict. "Jack Whitman," he said, voice steady as iron. "This is your last warning. Lower your weapon. Now." The block fell into a silence so sharp it almost hurt. Every breath stilled, every phone held steady. In that instant, you could feel the weight of history pressing down on a small-town street. Power against power, pride against truth. One gun against an entire system. And the whole world, every last one of us, was holding its breath to see which would break first. I've seen crowds gather for parades, for summer festivals, for Friday night football games. But never like this. This wasn't planned, no schedule or music. It was raw, unshaped, and urgent. People streamed in from side streets, drawn by the flashing lights and the way voices were rising like a tide. Phones shot up everywhere, dozens of little red record dots blinking in the heat. Every angle was covered front side over shoulders, even from car windows, where drivers had stopped to watch. Each camera was a witness, each frame another nail in the coffin of denial. The teenager's live stream, the one that had started shaky and unsure, was now screaming across the internet. Hundreds of thousands of views in minutes. Comments flying faster than she could read them. Hashtags burned to life. Hashtag racial bias. Hashtag justice for cross at Maplewood stop. By the time she whispered it's trending, her voice was drowned by the notifications pinging like fireworks. And yet, even as the digital storm exploded, the block itself was still caught in its own thunder. People shouted over one another. Some were furious. Put the gun down. We see the badge. Others were defensive, muttering that the officer had a job to do, that you can't be too careful these days. The split ran through the street the way it was running through every living room glued to the live stream. A nation arguing with itself in real time. Then the news vans appeared. First a local affiliate, their logo slapped across the side of a van that barreled to a stop at the corner. A cameraman tumbled out before the engine even shut off lens cap, already off microphone cable trailing behind him. Another crew followed close, and then another. Within minutes, the scene wasn't just phone footage anymore. It was broadcast quality, network certified chaos. Through it all, the middle-aged man with the coffee never stopped shouting. His voice cracked, went hoarse, but he kept repeating the same line. That man is telling the truth over and over, louder each time until his words cut through the chants like a refrain. It wasn't polished, it wasn't political, but it was honest. And honesty in that moment carried further than anything else. The younger officer, Whitman's partner, stood off to the side, his hand twitching near his belt. He looked like a man standing in two worlds, one where he knew what was right, and another where he feared what it would cost him to act on it. His silence was louder than Whitman's shouts. A portrait of hesitation, of the kind of cowardice that props up systems more than the loudest abusers ever could. Phones kept climbing higher. People jostled for better views, shouting updates to the screens in their hands. It's the director, the FBI director, one woman cried. It's on Twitter already, another shouted. And she wasn't wrong. By then, feeds were clogged with clips, hot takes, debates, and demands for answers. The tension on that block was unbearable, but in a strange way, it had shifted. No matter what Whitman believed or refused to believe, the truth wasn't his to bury anymore. The crowd had multiplied it, the internet had magnified it, and the news vans had engraved it. Standing there, I realized something simple but terrifying. This story was out of his hands now. Out of all of our hands, really. It had become bigger than a traffic stop, bigger than Maplewood. It was a wound ripped open in public, too wide to hide, too loud to silence. The man with the coffee shouted once more, his voice breaking into a rasp. We all see who he is, and for the first time the crowd answered him back, not in pieces but together, a roar rising up from the street itself. That's when it struck me. The truth was already free, and nothing, no badge, no gun, no glare of authority could cage it again. What happened next didn't sound like heroics. It sounded like restraint. Agent Lewis Carter moved in with his hands open, palms visible, voice clear enough to cut through the noise. Weapon down, he said, not yelling, not begging, just stating the only fact that mattered. He angled to Whitman's side, never crossing the barrel, never giving the gun a reason. One step, then another. The crowd hushed the way a congregation does when it senses a prayer turning into an answer. Jack Carter said closer, now tone lower, steadier, almost personal. You're going to hand me that sidearm. For a beat, I thought Whitman would tighten his grip and try to stare the world down. Instead, pride flickered, then faltered. Carter's hand came up beneath Whitman's wrist, gentle, practiced, undeniable. A pivot, a press, a clean release. The gun left Whitman's hand and entered Carter's like it had been destined to finish that journey. Dozens of phones caught the exact second the barrel dipped. The corner store camera captured the whole exchange in a single quiet frame. The crowd exhaled as one. Some people cheered, some sobbed, some just sagged where they stood, as if a muscle they'd been clenching for 5 minutes finally let go. The teenager's live stream jolted and refocused, filling with a flood of hearts and thank yous and stunned relief. The coffee man put both hands on his knees, laughed once, and then shook his head like he couldn't believe calm could be this loud. Carter handed the weapon to the second agent, then turned to Whitman. "Step back, officer. No venom, no victory lap, just process reclaiming the scene from ego." Inside the SUV, Daniel Cross let out a long human breath. He turned his head toward the open air and spoke not to the agents, not to Whitman, but to every camera on that block. "This is not about me," he said, voice even steady and somehow tired. "It's about every man stopped before me without cause. It landed like a verdict you couldn't appeal." For a second, even the chance went quiet. And then the media machine found a higher gear. Reporters who'd arrived breathless started taking calls with one hand while pointing lenses with the other. Producers pushed alerts to newsrooms. Anchors on earpieces began speaking in that careful breaking news cadence. People on the teenagers' feeds started posting screenshots, old complaints with dull bureaucratic headings, and dates that stretched back years. Use of force exonerated. Professional conduct closed. Community concern, no action. The documents were thin on detail and thick with dust, but the pattern was there if you were willing to see it. Then someone dug up a settlement quiet sealed, never quite admitted to, but hard to mistake. The chat rolled IA flagged concerns. 2 prior stop and frisk incidents. Why wasn't any of this public? A local journalist shouted a question toward the van chief's office. Aware of these complaints, no one answered, but the silence did. What began as one man's disbelief was now laid out as a habit with paperwork. You could feel the crowd register it in waves, first the fact that the gun was gone, then the recognition that the gun had never been the only danger. The chant shifted. Shame. Do your job right, accountability now. Whitman stood off to the side, hands empty, face blank, in the way faces get when the plot is gone and all that's left is consequence. The younger officer stared at the ground, jaw tight, as if he'd finally seen the line he hadn't crossed and didn't know what to do with that knowledge. Carter didn't grandstand. He didn't pose for the cameras or point at the badge on Cross's dash. He spoke quietly into his cuff. Mike nodded once and started doing the work that keeps scenes from unraveling, coordinating space, speaking in calm sentences, making sure the truth had room to breathe. And truth did what truth does when it's finally given air. It spread. By the time a second Suburban slid in, the story was already bigger than Maplewood. Clips were stitched together side by side, Cross's badge catching the sun. Whitman dismissing it, the barrel lifting, then lowering. Carter's careful disarm. Cross's one sentence that reframed the morning. The narrative didn't belong to rumor anymore. It belonged to the record. Relief washed the block, but it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like grief mixed with gratitude. The ache of knowing how easily this could have gone the way so many others had, and the sober understanding that today's restraint didn't erase yesterday's harm. People hugged, people argued. People stood alone and stared at the pavement like it might answer the question they couldn't ask out loud. How many times did we miss this because no one was filming? I watched the teenager swipe tears from her cheek with the back of her wrist and keep the camera steady. I watched the coffee man straighten his shoulders and say to no one, "About time." I watched Daniel Cross sit perfectly still, as if moving too soon might make the moment smaller than it deserved to be. Justice had flashed quick and bright like lightning that finally found the tallest point. But when the light faded, what remained wasn't celebration. It was a map of the storm, old complaints, quiet settlements, a pattern tucked behind polite language. The crowd saw it, the cameras saw it, and for once, the people in charge were going to have to see it too. That's how the truth arrived on our street, not with a cheer, but with a choice. The gun was gone. The record was not. And the next chapter, what we'd demand, what they'd answer, was already gathering on the horizon. Weeks later, I found myself in a different kind of quiet, the kind you only get in a hearing room. Tall lamps, oak desks, nameplates that could stop a heartbeat. I wasn't at the table, just another body in the gallery, but I felt the weight of every microphone pointed at the front like a row of eyes. Daniel Cross took the oath and sat. He didn't speak right away. He let the room settle the way a surgeon lets the room breathe before the first cut. When he finally did, his voice carried without force. "Accountability is not vengeance," he said. "It is trust." No one shuffled, no one coughed. It sounded like a diagnosis and a prescription in the same sentence. A staffer dimmed the lights. Screens came to life our street in Maplewood caught from 6 angles at once. The badge glinting, the barrel lifting, Agent Carter's careful hands. And then the part I'll never forget, the teenager's clip, unsteady at first, then steady as she found her courage. Her voice, small but clear, filled the room. I didn't know who he was. I just knew it wasn't right. Silence followed like a tide going out, the kind that doesn't ask for applause because it has already taken the air. Cross didn't look at the screens. He looked at the members staring up at them. This is not about a title, he said. It is about the ordinary moment when law either protects a person or fails him. On Oakwood Avenue, it almost failed. It has failed others. You have the power to make that less true tomorrow than it was yesterday. Phones buzzed in pockets around me. A whisper moved through the row like wind through grass. The Department of Justice had just announced federal civil rights charges against Officer Jack Whitman. The notice was plain, almost dry. The meaning wasn't. Suspension without badge or gun. Shield of the uniform gone. Whatever protection the way we do things once offered, gone with it. A senator asked Cross what accountability should look like. He didn't give them a headline. He gave them a list: audits that don't vanish, training that teaches power to pause, body cam policies with teeth, consequences that land before the next name is added to a list no one wants to read out loud. He spoke like a builder, not an avenger. They called witnesses, policy people, legal scholars, a chief from another city who'd already changed his department and lived to tell the tale. And then near the end, a familiar figure in an unfamiliar suit stepped to the table. The coffee man from our curb. He didn't read from notes. He didn't need to. Justice doesn't begin in courtrooms, he said, voice a little rough the way it had been on our street. It begins when we refuse to stay silent. He wasn't there to be eloquent. He was there to be obvious. And obvious in that room landed like truth. Questions followed, good ones, thin ones, a few shaped like excuses. Cross kept answering in the same tone he'd used on our block, measured, exact, no spike of anger to let anyone change the subject. If he was tired, he didn't spend a second showing it. On the screens, the clips looped, not for spectacle, but for record. The committee entered them into evidence. The teenager's file had a case number now. The corner store camera had a citation. Our 5 minutes had become part of the country's paperwork. I checked my phone again. Headlines stacked: DOJ brings charges, officer indicted in traffic stop incident, Maplewood video prompts federal action. There it was, the system forced to look at itself in a mirror. It hadn't chosen the kind your phone can become when you refuse to put it down. No one cheered. That surprised me, and then it didn't. Relief isn't cheering. It's a long breath you didn't know you'd been holding. It's a room full of people deciding quietly that the next time has to cost less than the last time. Cross closed the way he began, without drama. The goal, he said, is not punishment for its own sake. It is a public promise kept so that a morning like ours does not depend on luck, cameras, or titles. He paused. Trust is policy, you can feel. The gavel came down, papers rustled, people stood blinking at the sudden light. On the steps outside, microphones bloomed like flowers, hungry for reactions. Some spoke, some hurried past. I stayed back, watching the foam of headlines roll outward and fade into the larger sea. If you're wondering how it felt, I'll tell you the truth, like a final high note held just long enough to carry into the next measure. The reckoning wasn't over. It had only learned to speak in full sentences. And as we filed out into the afternoon, the question wasn't whether the system had seen itself. It had. The question is what it would do with the face staring back after the cameras, after the quotes, when the work is quiet and only the mirrors watching. In the end, it wasn't a courtroom speech or a headline that lingered. It was a letter. Jack Whitman, once the officer who had drawn a gun on the director of the FBI, sat in a cell with nothing but pen and paper. His handwriting, stiff and uneven, carried no excuses. I believed I was defending the public, he wrote. I see now I was defending my fear. No clever turns, no plea for sympathy, just a late truth finally put on the page. Daniel Cross didn't hold a press conference. There were no flashing lights, no grand declarations in front of cameras. One evening, as the sun slid low across Maplewood, he walked alone down a quiet street, his coat unbuttoned, his steps unhurried. He had survived, yes, But in his silence, you could feel he understood the victory was never about his own survival. It was about something larger, the belief, fragile and necessary, that millions of others might now trust the law a little more than they did the day before. The teenager who had live-streamed the entire confrontation found herself sitting in front of a national audience just weeks later. Cameras circled her now, but she didn't shrink. When asked what gave her the strength to keep recording, she looked straight ahead and said, "You don't need to be powerful to tell the truth. You just need courage." The line traveled farther than any headline clipped into classrooms, youth rallies, and church sermons. She had become more than a witness. She was a symbol of what a generation could demand if it refused to look away. Back in Maplewood, the town that had worn its silence like a badge of order, people began talking. Neighbors gathered at porches and diners, conversations cautious at first, then sharper, truer. Some admitted things they had never said aloud, that they had looked away from prejudice, that they had mistaken suspicion for safety. Others confessed that the stop had forced them to see themselves in the mirror they'd been avoiding. It wasn't comfortable, but for the first time, it was honest. Cross never joined those discussions. He didn't need to. His presence had already done its work. A man who had risen through the ranks without relying on applause, he knew the story had grown beyond him. The badge he'd shown wasn't just proof of who he was. It was proof of what could no longer be denied. I remember the last words he gave to the Senate committee, the ones that didn't make the nightly news. They were quiet, but they cut deeper than anything else spoken that day. True power is not the ability to command fear. It's the courage to face the mirror before someone else holds it up. That line has stayed with me, maybe because it sounded less like a declaration and more like a warning, a reminder that mirrors find us whether we want them to or not. And so the story of that morning lives on, not in the barrel of a gun, but in the questions we still ask ourselves. What do we defend, our safety or our fear? Where does silence protect us, and where does it betray us? For Maplewood, for the country, for anyone who ever thought justice was someone else's job, the answer became harder to avoid. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like something deeper, the quiet shift that comes when the weight of truth finally forces you to stand straighter. And maybe that's all justice is in the end, not a shout, not a cheer, but an echo that lingers, asking you if you're brave enough to answer back. What we witnessed in this story isn't just about one officer or even one man holding his ground. It's about truth, accountability, and the courage to stand firm when silence would be easier. Real justice begins not in grand speeches, but in ordinary moments when people choose what's right over what's comfortable. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others, and don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more powerful stories that shed light on justice, humanity, and hope. Your support means the world to us. Every share, and every subscription gives our team the strength to keep creating meaningful content that inspires and connects. Remember this: whenever you see the name Mr. Max Stories, think of it as a symbol of courage, compassion, and the fight for truth.